Hello, this is Roy Blight again today, and we're continuing in our study of First Corinthians as we go through the Bible. And this first letter of Paul's is to the Corinthians is a very foundational letter. And it's an important letter to get to understand because it really relates so much to and so well to all of us. But understand also that Paul is a real person writing to real people, and you want to be able to understand where he's coming from. So let me start out today by continuing our discussion about the Apostle Paul before we get into the actual letter going to the Corinthians. So who is this Apostle Paul? The book of Acts tells us that Paul was present at the death of the first Messianic Christian martyr, Stephen, where it says he approved the stoning of Stephen. If you remember in Acts, Stephen was preaching the gospel, and the Pharisees and the religious leaders couldn't stand it. The power of the Spirit of God was upon him, and he was letting them know exactly where they were, and they stoned Stephen to death, and Paul was standing right there. And most of what we know about the Apostle Paul, also known as St. Paul or Saul of Tarsus, some people in the Messianic crowd like to refer to him as Rav Shaul. Comes from his very fact that he's very Jewish. And most of what we know about Paul, though, comes from the writings attributed to him and the book of Acts. Those are the main ways that we know about him, and he really did influence history in a big way. However, there are also writings from the late first and early second centuries that refer to Paul, including Clement of Rome's letter to the Corinthians as well. Paul is known as a Hebrew of Hebrews. Before becoming a follower of Yeshua the Messiah, Paul was a prime example of a righteous Jew, what a righteous Jew religiously would have looked like and would have been like. He came from a God-fearing family. He was a Pharisee like his father, and was educated by the respected rabbi named Gamaliel. His Jewish credentials included his heritage, his discipline, and his zeal. He was well known for these. And Paul was known to have spoken and written in several languages, including Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and Latin. His identity was very rooted in his Jewishness. But after his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, his identity as a Jew became secondary to his identity as a follower of Yeshua, the Messiah. And you have to understand that this is, in a big way, it tells us who he is, because he was a wonderful, strong man of faith. So as looking at Paul spent much of his ministry dismantling the idea that in order to have a saving faith in the Lord, Yeshua, Gentiles must first become Jewish by adopting the Mosaic law. There are many Jewish converts at that time, known as Judaizers, who went around saying, if you're going to be saved, you have to get circumcised and you have to follow the canon of the Torah, and you have to, do as we do. And Paul was saying, no, that's not what God is calling the Gentiles to do at all. Being a Hebrew of Hebrews lent Paul credibility and expertise when speaking to Jewish audiences, and helped him speak into the law's inability to make people righteous in and of itself. Paul was a Roman citizen, which is important in the story of his life because it plays a prominent part in the last part of his life. Paul, again, formerly Saul, was born in Tarsus, that's in Cilicia. It was a prosperous city in the province of Cilicia, which is today's Asia Minor or Turkey. This is what granted him his Roman citizenship. And this status gave him special privileges, and in some cases saved him from abuse from other people because he was a Roman citizen. Now, late in his life and ministry, Paul was put on trial, and his accusers asked that he stand trial in Jerusalem, where they planned to ambush and kill him. Paul leveraged his Roman citizenship to demand Caesar himself hear his case, which was his right to do as Roman. And the procurator had no choice but to grant Paul this right. So this is how his life ended up, on him heading for Rome. But he was born in Cilicia. Of course, he's well known in Jerusalem, and he was a Hebrew of Hebrews. Paul's life was ended in Rome before he could actually be heard by Caesar. And as seen from Paul's own letters, he was highly respected in the increasingly scattered Christian communities, many of which he founded himself. So he was very well known amongst friends and foes alike. His letters frequently addressed problems and questions these congregations wrote to him about. An apostle to the Gentiles, which was his calling given to him by the Lord. Paul's status as a Pharisee and his intense devotion to the law might have made him well suited to preach to the Jews, or so you would think, but God had other plans for him. However, Paul's calling was to go to the Gentiles. And before he ever preached the gospel, Yeshua said to Paul, this man, he said this to Ananias, this man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. So he was to preach to the Jew first and then the Greek, but the Greeks, of course, are the Gentiles, and that's who Paul was going to take the gospel to. And then he had his very well-known meeting with the Lord on the road to Damascus. Now, Paul's first letter to the believers of Corinth provides a fuller insight into the life of an early Christian community of the first generation, the first ones, and more than any other book of the New Covenant. That's why it's such a foundational letter, and it is so well represented by the letter Beit, as I spoke of yesterday. Through the book of First Corinthians, we can glimpse both the strengths and the weaknesses of this small group in a great city of the ancient world. These were men and women who had accepted the gospel. They were pagans, they were Gentiles, they were not Jewish. They accepted the gospel, though, through the preaching of Saul, Paul, and others. They were now trying to realize in their lives the implications of their faith and life in the Lord and how they were supposed to live their lives now. So this Paul is very much like their spiritual father, much more than just being the one who brought them to the Lord. Paul, who had founded the community in Corinth, had continued to look after it as a father, and he's responding both to questions that are addressed to him and to situations which had been brought to his attention and he'd been informed of. In doing so, Paul reveals much about himself in this book, his teaching, and the way in which he conducted his work of apostleship. Remember, Paul's calling was to be an apostle, which is an ambassador, which is a high calling. And Paul was talking a lot about these very things. Some things are puzzling in his letter to the Corinthians because we have the correspondence only in one direction. We only understand what Paul was saying to them. We don't understand the letters that were going to Paul because we're not privy to that information. For the person studying this letter to the Corinthians, the first Corinthians letter, it seems to raise as many questions as it answers. However, without it, our knowledge of life in a Christian community in the first century, in the middle of this first century, would be much poorer. So understand that we get a lot of insight. We gain a lot from this letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. And it's important that we understand what they were going through as a community in that first century. Paul established a Christian community in Corinth about the year 51 AD. It's just a few years actually before he died on his second missionary journey. The city, which was a commercial crossroads, was a melting pot full of devotees of various pagan cults and marked by a measure of moral depravity, not unusual in a great seaport. And remember, this is ancient Greece, and it was very morally down, you might say. And Corinth was a crosstown, a crossroads, which invited all kinds of different pagan beliefs and upright living. So in the book of Acts, we see the moderate success that Paul had among the Jews there at first, but how they soon turned against him. And more fruitful was his time spent among the Gentiles, which won to the faith many of the city's poor and their underprivileged. And he had great success with the Gentiles. After his departure from Corinth, the eloquent Apollos, who was an Alexandrian Jew, and he was a believer, rendered great service to the community. He followed Paul into Corinth and did a great job. And while Paul was in Ephesus, this is where he received disquieting news about the Corinthians. And this is what really prompted him to write this letter to the Corinthians. The community was displaying open factionalism, They're going in, they're being political. They're getting into this faction and that faction. As certain members were identifying themselves exclusively with individual Christian leaders. We see this often today. And they were interpreting Christian teachings as a superior wisdom for the initiated few. They were getting into Gnosticism, and they were getting into things they shouldn't be, and they were getting away from the simple truth of God's word. They were getting away from the gospel itself, and they were factionalizing or going in many different directions, very much like the church today, which is actually in thousands of different directions. The community at Corinth also lacked the decisiveness to take appropriate action against one of its members who was living publicly in an incestuous union with someone. Other members had been engaged in legal conflicts with pagan courts of law. Still others may have been participating in religious prostitution and or temple sacrifices. The pagan ways of the Corinthians were starting to creep back into the body of Messiah, and this is what Paul is writing to in his letter, his first letter to the Corinthians. So it was a very important time, and we need to understand that this, in Paul's eyes, and it, in fact, was a very grave time, and it was an important time for people to understand what is going on. We desperately need today this kind of spirit in our churches where corrections are being made, because so much of the world is starting to creep into what we're doing, and we don't want to be influenced by the world. Remember this as I head out for today. You want to remember that revival comes in God's house. Revival comes when the Spirit of God is allowed in and the world is gone. But when the world gets in, revival doesn't come. That's when apostasy sets in. So remember that, and we'll touch more upon these subjects tomorrow as we continue in our study of Paul's letter to the Corinthians. God bless you. Have a wonderful day. Hit the like button. Subscribe to the station. God bless you. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.